big honor to be here with all of you today. To Mark and Shayla in the audience, really nice to see you. And to others that I know that are also here, great to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen to begin a presentation. Let's see. Can you all see this? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me see. Okay, so I'm gonna talk today mainly about my book and the research behind it, in how corporations use disinformation to undermine political will for a very effective public health and environmental policy. I am not an alcohol expert. I'm trying to build on the work of other experts that are here, but a lot of the ways that industry uses narratives are the same regardless of the public health issue. And a lot of the underlying ideological or financial capture issues that exist between corporations, public health organizations, and research institutions are quite the same regardless of which industry or which health issue we're talking about. I'm eager to answer any questions along the way as I'm presenting. We'll leave it to Phil and Andy to see how we want to make that happen, if you should be on video questions or just from the comments, but I won't be able to see your comments in the chat while I'm presenting because I have the full screen in front of me. So please beep me if you have a question or want to interrupt me. So I love this quote. Some of you may have heard it. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Many of you know that Mark Twain said this. The best thing about this Mark Twain quote, I think, is actually that Mark Twain never said it. Further underscoring how great this quote is. I'm going to use it a couple of times in the presentation today. I think it's important to start with this, especially given the level of capture globally the public health community has had forever. I mean, Mark, this is one of your Nason and May's papers here on the left. And then this is a screenshot of who DrinkAware was funding just a few years ago. I think the screenshot from 2020, or funded by. So you have these NGOs that are ostensibly working to the public benefit that are clearly captured by industry. And it's essentially, DrinkAware is essentially an industry organization. But that's really kind of the tip of the iceberg for the direct capture that we're looking at. If you look at just across the board, the universities around the world that are funded by the alcohol industry, I mean, this is just a quick snapshot. It's hard to find universities that aren't funded by industry, is more to the point. So our entire research community looking at alcohol, or not even looking at alcohol, is tainted. We have all been influenced and surrounded by people that have been influenced by the alcohol industry. And a lot of the stuff that we take as axiom, or that we take to just fundamentally be true, has been largely shaped by industry without us even knowing it. So I think it's really important to be willing to question the things that we see as sacred cows, because we might actually be believing things that are harmful to the goals that we ostensibly seek to achieve. The United Nations similarly works very closely and has worked very closely for a very long time with alcohol industry and other industries. This then further shapes the way we globally think about alcohol, what we don't talk about, what we don't say, the things that are just not on the table. And then the way that each issue and the solutions to our issues are defined are being highly influenced by industry. NGOs all around us are being funded by alcohol industry. Again, further shaping and surrounding us with industry narratives in places where we would least expect it. And to such an extent that I think we just don't understand deeply enough the level to which we are captured. So we really need to go back and look at what we know for sure that just ain't so. And I'm going to cover a lot of that today. Some of it Some people might be surprised by. Some people have heard it from me before. If you've met me or heard some of my presentations or read my book Dark PR. But please feel free to challenge me along the way if you would like. In terms of capture, just to kind of recap, funding, of course, is one form of capture. And funding different actors through different layers of front groups is very commonly known. There's another kind of capture that I think is very important, is the people and organizations and institutions that actually aren't taking money from industry, but because everybody else is, they or we have adopted their ideas without realizing it. I call it environmental capture. Sometimes this is called the creeping colonialization of ideas, or cultural capture, whatever you want to call it. It's a big problem that I don't think we recognize enough. We can be captured ideologically without ever ourselves having to have been funded or directly influenced by industry. The way around this, of course, in terms of the direct capture, is to make sure we never take money from industry in any way. Self-funded, member-led organizations are best, but this still doesn't solve the problem of environmental capture. I also want to start, instead of looking at solutions to alcohol harm from an additive standpoint, I think we need to take a step back and realize that a lot of subtractive solutions would probably be more appropriate. It's not that the system is broken, but it's that we've built it this way. For example, rather than thinking of the nanny state being something that we would look to solve our problems, and it's like intruding on our lives, the nanny is actively killing us right now. The government is subsidizing alcohol. So a lot of the policies that we have in place are actually incentivizing ill health. So we could do a lot just by getting rid of the policies on the books that are actively harming us. That's not the case across the board for everything. In some cases, taxes and other things for harmful industries would be good. But I think that when we take into account the polluter pays principle, we would recognize is that taxes, in fact, in some ways are just offsets to implicit subsidies. And they're not really nanny state subsidies. They're more so offsets to an existing nanny state that is actively harming the public interest. Here's another example of another health issue that's actively subsidized. This is an Australian example. So Australian, according to a calculation I did with a colleague of mine, or a friend of mine some years back, we found that Australia subsidizes ultra-processed food manufacturers $5 billion per year. We looked at what they should have paid in taxes, and then what they did pay in taxes after all of the deductions that they were given. Quite shocking to see these numbers. And you could do similar kinds of calculations around in other countries if you have the data available, of course. If you look at fossil fuel subsidies, for example, the globally government subsidized fossil fuels, $7 trillion per year. So a lot of these health issues could be addressed by removing these subsidies. And if you look, you see here is a diagram showing diabetes incidence over time and the price of sugar dramatically collapsing over time. When you subsidize goods like sugar or ultra-processed foods or alcohol or fossil fuels or driving, you make them cheaper. You make all of these harmful products cheaper, people use more of them, and then you have more disease incidents or health harms. So again, we live on a nanny state planet, and the nanny is killing us. I think it's a very helpful way of framing a lot of these problems, rather than thinking of them as something that we need additive solutions to. Then I wanted to quickly touch on what we know works for solving health problems. We know that taxes on things that are harmful make people use less of them. Removing subsidies makes people use less of them. Changing the proximity of things to us makes people use less of them. If we make things further away, for example, alcohol-free zones would be an example for alcohol, or sometimes called dry zones, or by modifying the temporality of our policies. So making it illegal for people under 21 to drink alcohol, or making it illegal to sell or buy alcohol on Sundays or after 5, or you name it. These policies really work. And industry works very hard to shift debates so that we don't talk about these policies and they stay off the agenda. The way that they do that is by framing debates. They work to make sure that we just keep a focus and a discourse on other things. Because if we're focused on other things, we're not focused on what matters. Politics is zero sum. By having attention on one thing, you have less attention on other things. And that's something very difficult for a lot of people to keep in mind, that political will is not something that allows us to do both, to do things that are ineffective and to do things that are effective, or to use narratives that are ineffective combined with those that are effective. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today, but the core of all of this is this kind of political will pie chart here, this zero-sum pie chart of political will. Framing by industry helps to make sure that we have less attention on what really matters. You're all kind of familiar with PR and framing, I'm sure. This is a pretty good example of it. If you look and try and figure out the number of the parking spot, just take a second to look at this diagram and guess the number where the car is, what's underneath the car. I'll give you a couple seconds to play with this in your head. Okay, what if I frame the question a little differently though? I think for everybody now looking at this, it's a lot more clear. Small changes to the way we visualize diagrams, to the way we use words and present information, lead to dramatically different levels of understanding and political support. Here's like 2 different framing techniques for advertising a piece of property. Is it a small room? Is it a cozy room? More common ones are like pro-choice, pro-life in discussions about abortion. Minimum wage laws versus what industry likes to call the right to work laws, which is getting rid of minimum wages. Health policy versus nanny state, et cetera, et cetera. These are small differences in framing that make a really big difference. And then the way we get people to believe a given frame or not believe a different given frame is how many times they've heard it. It doesn't really matter how accurate the information is, so much as the level of exposure. If we inundate a population with information, true or false, they'll be more likely to believe it, which is quite terrifying. And I should take a moment at least to explain the way this is now happening in the information age. Bot farms are one of the most common ways that advertisers and malicious actors can spread and amplify framing. So here's an example of what a bot farm looks like. So that's a series of cell phones. That's that echo. And somebody needs their, Thank you very much. Those bot farms are a series of cell phones that are all connected to central computers, where the computers will manage thousands and thousands of Twitter or Blue Sky or Facebook accounts to retweet or amplify given narratives. I'm about to show you an interview with a former bot farm operator explaining how this works.
I'm a former tech employee, created and sustained a bot farm between 2015 and 2018. Give you guys some information because American bot farm operators are pretty rare. Most bot farms operate overseas. I don't know if there's anyone like me in the US that can tell you this stuff is all I'm saying. I'm typically way more secretive about this, but it's gotten so bad I need to talk about it. So what is a bot farm? Something that a company or an individual purchases. You get a set amount of bots that, like normal people, go out and spread your message. Now here's the work that goes into that. I, as the operator, have have to create each individual fake person. I have to create a bio, I have to create a picture, a username, a real name. Then I have to generate content. It has to be supportive of the message that the client is paying for, positive opinion of the company or the individual. If anyone has ever tried to create content, that takes time and it also takes ideas. It's not easy. Finally, you need to program those bots based on activity. Bots respond to what you do. You think that you going around and liking things is invisible. It's not. You're leaving a footprint across the app. That footprint is tracked by people like me. So based on what other people like or comment on, I program my bot to go and search for those people, find them, and then interact with them with my content that supports the message that I've created. This programming also includes research to find the people that are the most susceptible to believing the message that you're selling and targeting those people. This is just scratching the surface of like what it takes to program one of these, and people are buying hundreds of them. Now here's the interesting part. The software to run all those bots is not free, and the time that it takes to create all the things that I just told you about also not free. All of this stuff costs money, and it represents money when you see it. If you're seeing non-stop videos posted with a certain agenda, someone's paying for that. So when you see a dump of ton of media that's telling you all the same message, do not say, wow, what a thing happening right now. Please instead say, wow, who's trying to buy my opinion on this topic?
And that's very important, this who's paying discussion. Many people think disinformation is an issue of the what I call the viral theoretical model of disinformation, where it's like people spreading it. Sometimes I'll call this the idiot uncle model, where it's like our uncle that lives in a very rural area, it's on the computer way too much, and they just keep sharing, toxic misinformation. That's really not what's happening. It's really not what's happening. You're having millions and billions of euros and pounds and dollars spent to amplify disinformation. This downstream understanding of disinformation, where we can just educate our way out of it by teaching people to be more resilient to disinformation, won't work, because fundamentally what matters is the quantity of exposure. It's not how smart the individual is that really matters. It's how much exposure they have to the message. And we need to be going upstream and ending this amplification of disinformation. And just quickly, this is really not an issue about convincing everybody. When I'm talking about these narratives today, we're not talking about convincing the whole world of these sometimes rather ridiculous ideas. You really only need to convince a small margin of a given population in order to sway a very large election, be it a referendum or what you name it, or to sway political support for a policy such as an alcohol tax or minimum unit pricing or something. If you see on the screen in front of you, you've got all these elections, and you can see very small margins, and all of them were these elections have a lot of documented disinformation around them. So you got to wonder, were they thrown by disinformation campaigns? It's quite possible. So I'm now going to talk about the framework, the cross-industry playbook as I've documented in my book. In my book, I cover, in Dark PR, I cover the automobile crashes, road crashes, and the road industry, the toxic food environment, diabetes, overweight and obesity, and like the sugar industry, and then the global warming and the fossil fuel industry. And I demonstrate that they use the same playbook of 9 devious frames, and this playbook can be applied to any industry and issue. So I'm going to go over some of the issues I covered in my book, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the way the alcohol industry uses these narratives as well. I'd love to know if you think that my adaptation of this to the alcohol industry and alcohol harm is accurate, or if you think I should use a different example. So if you have any thoughts on the way I present this information, I'd be glad to know it, because I think many of you are alcohol experts, far more well-versed in this than me. So the first is denialism. I think this is a very important frame, of course, but we spend way too much time on it. We know that industry denies that their products are harmful. Of course, the tobacco industry famously did this, but other industries do the same. Alcohol industry downplays cancer risk. When we talk about industry disinformation, it tends to stop here, and that's really too bad. This is really just scratching the surface of disinformation. We need to go much deeper. Next is what I call post-denialism. Post-denialism seems ridiculous, but it really does shift the needle and on the Overton window on what we think is acceptable and what we think is true around us. So I'll show an example from the fossil fuel industry in Australia, which is quite striking.
This can provide endless possibilities. It can create light and jobs, delivering $6 billion in wages for Australians. It produces steel and powers our homes, as well as our economy, injecting $40 billion each year, and it can now reduce its emissions by up to 40%. It's coal. Isn't it amazing what this little black rock can do? Authorised G. Evans, Canberra.
That's the Australian Coal Association or something to that effect that sponsored that. This is the
This can provide.
Presenting the possibilities of plastics. Plastics help save you from dents and broken bones. It helped protect my patella. They help save energy.
Thin light plastics, fewer trucks, less gas.
They help save you from being scrambled. They help save the soda. They help food stay fresher.
Brussels sprouts?
Plastics can even help save toddlers from trouble.
And this vest helped save my dad's life.
Plastics make it possible.
So famously, industry said Guinness is good for you, cigarettes will help you live longer, and that sugar will help you lose weight. Alcohol industry famously said that small amounts of red wine can make you live longer. The tobacco industry famously did this campaign under Edward Bernays called Torches of Freedom, where they marketed cigarettes as something that were liberating for women. They paid for all these actresses to do fake protests and smoke cigarettes. And they did, I don't know if you all remember, but I remember this very strikingly, that some years back, the alcohol industry started trying to convince the feminist community that it was a liberatory act to drink alcohol while pregnant, because there was no evidence to actually definitively say alcohol was harmful to the fetus, which dramatically shameful that they were doing that. But they're basically saying like alcohol is part of women's liberation. This is, please correct me if anybody thinks I've got that a little bit wrong. This is me operating from memory. This is you all are the experts on this subject, but across the board, we have a lot of documented cases of alcohol being framed as something beneficial either to society, to social justice, or to health itself, which we now know pretty clearly is nonsense. The industry also likes to normalize debates. This framing of normalization is common across all issues with harmful industries. So industry funds the fat acceptance movement, for example. The automobile lobby has long called car crashes accidents to normalize them. We know that the fossil fuel industry has promoted the term climate change over global warming in order to normalize global warming and make it seem less scary. And that all of these terms, when they get message tested, lead to less political support for meaningful policy interventions. This normalization framing really works to reduce political will. In the case of alcohol, you see this kind of normalization all the time. There's this quote here on the bottom by the distinguished Shayla, who's here on the call with us, noting how alcohol industry likes to normalize drinking, pairing it with sports. You see this in research from Mark, who's also on the line with us today. And across the board, industry tries to frame drinking, and especially moderate drinking, as normal, as part of everyday life, natural, historical, something humans have always done. Because why would you regulate something that's natural and normal? The remaining 6 frames are all in one way or another solutions frames or pseudo solution frames or false solutions. And so this is where we get into you can't be doing both in terms of framing and political will. The more people believe even slightly in false solutions, the less they support the really powerful stuff. You can't be doing both. We can't be doing both. And I'll explain that more in depth as we go along. What I call the silver boomerang frame. This is an industry framing where they promote something that boomerangs back in some kind of harmful way. So the more you make devices energy efficient, for example, the more people use them. So industry loves to promote energy efficiency in the case of global warming. Industry loves to promote exercise for weight loss, very famously. And the more we get exposed to this kind of stuff, like exercise in order to lose weight, the less we focus on the food environment. We get stuck on looking at the thing that doesn't work rather than what does. And we know that the more exercise you do, the hungrier you get. So we don't really see any gains from weight loss. We see other kinds of health gains. Exercise is great. It's just not going to solve the overweight pandemic that we're dealing with globally now. In the case of alcohol, I identified 2 things that I thought might be silver boomerangs. You all researchers in the audience that are specialists on this might have a wiser opinion than me. But one thing you see is this narrative that, oh, we should teach our kids to drink when they're very young. Which I believe the evidence now shows that if you do that, you see more binge drinking later in life. So there's this rebound when you teach kids to drink when they're very young, that they then end up drinking too much. Possibly also is this argument that you should hydrate while you're drinking, but I also suspect that probably leads to people drinking more. I'll leave this one to the wisdom of the crowds if anybody wants to leave some good ideas in the comments. But this silver boomerang framing for alcohol, for sugar, for diabetes, for road safety, for global warming, it's pervasive. We see it all the time. The next frame in the Stevius frame playbook is the magic frame. So autonomous cars will save us from the road death pandemic globally, or carbon capture storage is going to solve us from global warming, or that diabetes can be solved with genetic cures. And genetics I really see as the magic frame for alcohol. This idea that, you know, alcohol abuse is an issue of genetics. But we know, like in the case of diabetes, for example, that it's not genetic. I talk about this at length in my book. This is a little bit touchy in some sectors, but you don't have these kinds of skyrocketing rates of change being associated with genetic change. Humans are not fundamentally genetically different than they were 100 years ago, and yet our diabetes incidence rates are skyrocketing. But the same attribution that genetics is the cause of smoking, genetics is the cause of diabetes, is used over and over again by industry, and for alcohol. So here you can see Drink IQ. Drink IQ is a website funded by Diageo, or perhaps Mark, you would know better than I. I think it just might be a Diageo website. I'm not entirely sure. But you see the industry promoting this idea that genetics, and somehow we need a genetic cure for alcoholism, and that'll solve our issues with alcohol harm. This framing is very powerful. Treatment frame. This is the idea that rather than end the subsidies for alcohol or regulate alcohol, we could just treat the harms of alcohol. Like, we can just give people more medicine, or invest money in healthcare, you name it. Industry loves to shift health problems from prevention to the treatment of them. Because the more you believe in the treatment being the solution, the less you support the policy change for prevention. And that's pretty well documented. In the case of alcohol, you can see, I mean, this is just one of many examples of industry promoting healthcare infrastructure or funding hospitals, or a lot of the time they fund like health races, like running races and stuff. I think you all have probably seen the alcohol industry doing this kind of thing. Oops. This is the CEO of ExxonMobil talking about how global warming can be solved by treating it, by adapting to global warming rather than preventing it.
Not disputing that increasing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is going to have an impact. It'll have a warming impact. How large it is what is very hard for anyone to predict. And depending on how large it is, then projects how dire the consequences are. As we have looked at the most recent studies coming out in the IPCC reports, which I've seen the drafts, and I can't say too much because they're not out yet. But when you predict things like sea level rise, you get numbers all over the map. If you take what I would call a reasonable scientific approach to that, we believe those consequences are manageable. They do require us to begin to exert or spend more policy effort on adaptation. What do you want to do if we think the future has sea level rising 4 inches, 6 inches? Where are the impacted areas, and what do you want to do to adapt to that? And as human beings, as a species, that's why we're all still here. We have spent our entire existence adapting. Okay, so we will adapt to this. Changes to weather patterns that move crop production areas around, we'll adapt to that. It's an engineering problem, and it has engineering solutions. And so I don't, the fear factor that people want to throw out there to say, we just have to stop this, I do not accept. I do believe we have to be efficient and we have to manage it, but we also need to look at the other side of the engineering solution, which is how are we going to adapt to it? And there are solutions. It's not a problem that we can't solve.
So here's some of the research on the way adaptation or treatment framing is found to either crowd out budget for prevention or to keep political will low for prevention. We know very well that this happens. The next frame is probably the toughest one, and I think the Mark Twain quote that is not a Mark Twain quote is probably most apt for this section. We've been captured globally, like the do-gooder community, the public health community. We are so surrounded by industry narratives, we don't even realize where we've been adopting industry arguments. Individualization, individualism, sometimes called informationism, victim blaming, idealism, agency, choice, responsibilization. This frame, I called in my book victim blaming, but it's much more than that. It's keeping the focus of responsibility on the individual. And a lot of us don't realize it, but we continue to endorse public policy and public health interventions, which are keeping the focus of responsibility on the individual, but we don't realize it. And this is why this one section's a little tough for a lot of people to get. If anybody would like to get a copy of my book, I can email them a PDF for all of the sources. Or if you'd like to discuss things about this with me, email me at grant.ennis@monash.edu. And I can provide more information. Phil also has my email if you just want to ask him for it. Reminder, these things work. These things change human behavior. It's a framework I came up with in my book. The price, proximity, and temporality are the things that change the way humans behave at a population level, and nothing else. And that's a really strong argument to make. I'd be glad to be challenged on it, but I'm pretty convinced that this theoretical framework on how human behavior works is solid. This is changing the material environment rather than the information environment, which does not change human behavior, such as education, persuasion campaigns, pledge drives, performative congruency acts, non-disclosure forms, labels, plain packaging, advertising bans. Some of these things can be very good when they don't individualize things. When they're talking about issues at a population level, so education exposing people to the way politics works, persuasion campaigns encouraging people to view public health issues from a public population lens, labels which explain public health issues from a public health perspective, plain packaging and advertising bans are both very good in taking away industry's ability to manipulate us. But none of these things actually changes human behavior. And that's important, because when we look at the claims that many of our colleagues and friends and industry make about these interventions, when we make claims that these interventions change behavior, normally we're not doing it from a position of strong evidence. What we're doing is we're conflating knowledge, attitudes, behavioral intentions, self-reported behavior with observed behavior, or worse, with documented impact. And you can easily change knowledge, you can easily change attitudes, you can change behavioral intentions, you can even change self-reported behavior. You can even, pie hack, you can cherry pick, you can leverage positive results bias, you can use variable completion, you can conflate clinical significance with statistical significance, and you can say you've got observed behavior or documented behavior to small amounts. But I think most people are aware, you don't actually see real changes in documented impact of any clinical significance from informationist interventions. And I think we need to be a lot more honest about that, because the underlying narrative from industry is that we don't need to change public policy. We don't need to change public health policy in order to solve these health crises. All we need to do is shift the focus onto the individual and help them to make better choices. And this framing is constantly being financed and supported by industry efforts. In terms of alcohol control, in terms of all public health issues, anything that industry makes money off of, they boost this narrative. I think as a public health community, we need to do a better job of recognizing this is a very devious framing, acknowledging that it doesn't work to change behavior. And I think we need to more deeply understand, when we message test labels, we message test campaigns for behavior change, what we are actually doing is message testing against public policy.
Not just
testing against public policy, because when you are promoting one frame, you are reducing support for another. So when you message test for individual responsibility, getting people to intend to change their behavior, you're getting people to believe that it's not public policy that needs to change, it's individuals. And we need to do a much better job of recognizing that. And this is a framing technique that's consistently used, as I said already, by all industries. And we know it undermines political action. That's why industry uses it. And the evidence for why this framing is so difficult and harmful is so consistent and old over the years. We get more and more studies showing that it's harmful. And yet many of our colleagues continue to embrace it. And that's understandable, because we are so surrounded by industry influence that we don't even realize it. Here's an example from feminism. The more women are told they need to lean in order to achieve women's liberation, the less women will support public policy that would lead to them getting equal pay. The more we place the responsibility for women's rights on individual women, the less women place responsibility for women's rights on the political system. Very scary. Very, very scary. So when we blame the victims of the food environment for the political system, when we individualize it, people are less supportive of policy change. When we say, just lose weight, eat less today, when we say the solution to the overweight pandemic is better food labels, we are keeping the responsibility for the pandemic on the label reader. The same for the carbon footprint, which I'm going to show some more content on in a moment. The same for the alcoholic, the harmful drinker, the alcohol abuser. When we keep the focus of responsibility for alcohol harm on the individual by focusing on narratives in our debates like we need better labels, to help people be warned and make better choices, we are undermining our efforts for policy change for things like minimum unit pricing, for alcohol tax, for dry zones, all of these other things. We need those things. We need those policies in place. And those are the policies that we should be focusing on. But industry loves it when we focus on what should be on the label instead. Here's some studies that show that like food labels don't lead to behavior change. We want labels. We just don't want labels message tested for individual responsibility, which by and large is what's happening right now. Carbon labels also don't work. I spent like 20 minutes finding these studies, so I'm sure there's even more out there, but it was pretty consistent when I was looking at the research on actual outcomes from labels on alcohol, that they didn't end up changing behavior. You change knowledge, you change behavioral intentions, you change other stuff, but you don't end up with any kind of actual outcomes from labels. So I'm not sure, I don't think we should continue to keep labels as something that we claim behavioral change for. We need to see labels as something that can lead to better support for more powerful policy action later. But we need to do two things differently. We need to stop saying that labels change behavior, and we need to stop making them the focus of all of our efforts. At least as an outsider from the alcohol control community, my take is that they are pretty much the focus of our efforts to influence policy at this moment. So here's just a bunch of studies that I found very quickly, and that labels don't change behavior.
Hi, Greg. Can we maybe we can give it a couple more minutes, and then we can move to questions, because particularly this labeling thing, I'm sure people will want to tune in on. So
I'll wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks. So, similarly with again, Mark, this is you and your colleagues doing great work. Alcohol. Am I still online? I heard a beep.
Oh yeah, so you're still online. That was just someone joining in.
Okay.
Okay.
So pledges. I promise that I will drink less. These things don't work. Advertising bans. Similar. Advertising bans are great because they deprive industry of an ability to manipulate us, but they don't lead to behavior change. And the claims that they do are really quite harmful. I'm going to speed through. I'm going to skip some of the videos and carbon footprint stuff. This one is mass media campaigns don't change behavior. We know this. All of these kinds of interventions could be good if they were focused on societal and public policy issues and stuff. But when you message test them for behavior change, they end up undermining our efforts. This quote, usually if I had more time, I'd ask somebody in the audience to read it out. I love this tweet. I still think my favorite thing that's ever happened to me on the internet is the time a guy said, people change their minds when you show them facts, such as labels. And I said, actually, studies show that's not true, and linked 2 sources. And he said, yeah, well, I still think it works. I get that reaction quite a lot when I present this information. But if you dig and you look at the studies on informationist interventions, we consistently find 0 population level material change in the public health issue we're trying to solve. And then when you test levels of political support after exposure to these messages, we end up with much less support for meaningful policy change as a result of this kind of messaging. And we know very well we can't be doing both. You can't be doing individual framing and population framing. You undermine your political support for population framing. Frameworks Institute sometimes also calls this splitting the frame. I call it multifactorialism that I'm going to talk about really quickly as I wrap up in a moment. Last two frames, knotted web framing, sometimes called complexity. So you have industry saying, you know, that alcohol problems are complex. Mark Pettigrew, who's on the line, has done some really great writing on this, as well as some of his colleagues. Natalie Savona, if I'm remembering the name right. Great work. The alcohol, this is Drinkaware again, this is Diageo, and all the other alcohol industry actors saying alcohol harm is complex. So complex, so circular, so knotted, so web-like that it's impossible to take action on. We know that knotted web framing or complexity framing undermines strong political action. Road safety is complex, climate change is complex, according to Chevron. Here's ExxonMobil, climate change is complex. Final frame before I wrap up, because we're running low on time, is multifactorialism. Multifactorialism is this idea of like diabetes, genetics, lifestyle, and exercise are the necessary combination of solutions to solve the problem. In alcohol, maybe it's alcohol harm is the result of a complex multifactorial interaction between genes, lifestyle, you know, and policy or something. It's this idea that, you know, it's not one thing. The source of the problem is really multifactorial. This goes back to the tobacco industry from the 70s. This is the Roper proposal, or sometimes called the Panzer memo. We know that industry uses multifactorialism under a lot of different names in order to undermine political will for action. Here's Coca-Cola saying obesity is multifactorial. Industry always does this. And we know that multifactorialism, it's treated as if it's axiom in a lot of public health communities, but multifactorialism is really, there's nothing special about it. It's treated as if it was a virtue, but it's definitely not. It distracts us and it undermines our ability to take meaningful action on the material levers of health. I'm gonna, Phil, I'll wrap up here. I know we've got a lot of discussion to go through. Go to the last slide. Over to you, Phil.
I'll press the right button this time. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left in this half of the session, but I'm sure some of these themes will cross over into the second session with Alice, who I gather has just joined us. So yeah, I think what I should probably do is ask somebody, maybe Peter, if you're available, to jump on and sort of bat for labeling and some of the benefits I think you mentioned in the chat there. If you just jump on the.
Yeah. I mean, thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Grant said about labeling, and I agree with the other points that people have made. And Grant made that labeling can be a way to build commitment for other things. But I think my point was that I think it certainly is it's the labeling issue can be a useful way to kind of open the box on why do we not have labeling? Why do we have nutritional information on yogurt in Europe and we don't have it on beer? In fact, we have nutritional information on alcohol-free beer, but not on alcoholic beer, and that's simply due to lobbying and stuff. So I think it can be a useful way to to open that box. But if I could actually take the opportunity to ask Grant a very specific thing about the silver bullet framing. And the reason I ask that is we went through minimum unit price in Scotland, and a very kind of common thing from people who didn't like the idea was to say, this is not a silver bullet, right? Now, the advocates never said it was a silver bullet, but when you're in debate, how do you actually handle that? So I'm never quite sure what a straw man argument is, if that's a straw man argument, but I don't know, if I'm clear what I'm getting at. How do you kind of handle that going, well, this isn't a simple issue, it ties up with your complexity point. But so specifically, if someone, said to you, Grant, well, taxation isn't a silver bullet. How do you actually handle that in the here and now of the debate and discussion?
Well, yeah, I mean, they are straw manning you, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're really trying to put you in a position that you weren't making the case for, especially because the minimum unit pricing, the levels are usually set quite not set terribly high. In taxation is not set so terribly high that you couldn't buy a drink. I think you have to pivot. I think in a conversation like that, you'd have to pivot. I take it back a moment to subsidies and implicit incentives. So if you calculated the cost of alcohol harm to society, and then you looked at like how much alcohol tax would recoup of that, you were still subsidizing alcohol. So try and change the framing and get away from them. Don't when you look at the way we're supposed to deal with these kinds of more heated debates, you never want to repeat the framing of the opponent party. So don't even say, well, I don't think I'm saying it's a silver bullet. Don't mention it. Just like go with what you want. We're subsidizing an alcohologenic environment at the moment. I mean, that's probably not very good framing. Maybe skip the alcohologenic bit, but you get the idea. Stick with what you want. And then with labels, I think, thank you for your comments, Peter, and totally agree as well. I just want to repeat, the important thing is to not message test for behavior change.
Thanks very much, Grant. I think also Eric Carlin came in with a point, a former WHO person. Maybe you'd be able to just make your 2 pence.
Yeah, formerly Sharp with Peter as well. So you're hearing from Sharp twice as well. Grant, that was a brilliant presentation. I guess I don't end up agreeing with you in everything, in all of your conclusions, though. So I don't think that necessarily people who are supporting labelling are arguing that labelling is more important than anything else. You know, when we were looking at labelling at WHO Europe, very much we were approaching it in terms of finding out what does the evidence tell us about kind of what impact it can have, rather than saying that we thought it would bring about behaviour change. And certainly, I've put in the chat. It does raise awareness. It raises, you know, giving people information is a consumer right. You should actually know what's in a product that you're consuming that might do you harm. Whether or not having that information diverts attention away from support for other policies. That's where I lost you a bit in terms of your argument. I think that raising awareness of the harms in a product for individuals, you know, surely that would contribute to improving support for effective policies. The other thing I would say is that where I get confused a bit with the discussion as well is that it's a bit that with the silver bullet thing that Peter was talking about. I think that we're clear that we have to have a range of policies working together, and different policies will work better in different places at different times. So when we were writing the framework for alcohol in Europe, which I was the lead author on, we basically had 6 priority areas. The first 3 very clearly related to the best buys that you're covering in your book, so action on price, availability and marketing. But then we also had labelling, health services support, and that means actually supporting treatment. So actually it's not an argument against treatment or and for prevention and not treatment, but also community action, and actually kind of recognising that communities coming together over all of these areas to kind of raise public support and raise public awareness is going to be kind of what's actually going to affect the structural change that shifts us away from all this individual responsibility stuff. So I think what I'm saying overall is I agree with you with the whole gist of most of what you said, but I don't necessarily agree with all of your conclusions. It's great to be challenged, though.
So we're coming right to the end. Maybe there's time for one more point or one more question. If you can hit the raise hand button, and maybe we can pick you out that way. If anybody's got something, I don't know whether Sheila has mentioned a few points in the comments, but
no, just to say firstly, Grant, enormously entertaining, useful presentation. Thank you indeed. Just in relation to labelling, you know, to me, it's part and parcel of an overall package that's needed. We know that pricing is actually the thing that is probably most helpful in terms of reducing alcohol consumption, but there is evidence that will show that when people are exposed to warning labels, say about cancer, they're more likely to support introduction of pricing measures as a thing that's there. And I think it probably is one of our problems, is that as small NGOs and as everybody working in this field, there are many different things we could be working on at any one time. And I know that for us, that's a massive challenge, because we're simultaneously trying to get MEP increased, we're trying to get excise duties increased, and also we're trying to make sure that labelling, happens. And, clearly there's an industry that benefits enormously by there being these multiple things going on at any one time. But I just put a thing in there because I did find it interesting. I was reading Heineken labelled as their #1 business risk was regulation, and the 3 regulations that they specifically drew attention to included labelling of their products. So they certainly are concerned about labelling as a thing. And I like Peter's comment very much, because that it allows you to say, why don't we have labels? Like, and why is this industry being allowed to get away with blue murder, literally on the labeling thing? So I think there is something there. And I suppose maybe the lesson that I have to try and absorb is where's our best buy at any one particular time, and sometimes that can be, from a political point of view, we might just have an opening on something and we should take that. And I'm never 100% sure that I'm ever doing anything, correct in this, because politics isn't physics, unfortunately, and it's just a bit tricky to know what is sometimes the best and the right thing to do. So I did find your talk really interesting, and I'll have to look back at it again too for other stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And we've got one more time for one more quick point before we move on to the second session. It's Alistair McGilchrist, I think, is masquerading as Jean Leach. But
hi, Phil. It was kind of linked to Sheila's point, really, Grant. I quite like your zero-sum argument, but it does constrain you a bit. I mean, here in Scotland, SHAP has probably moved its focus in the past 5 to 10 years to include treatment policies. And that's partly, I guess, in response to pressure to do something for those already affected, despite knowing that, so much of what we do should be focused on what works, the prevention. So do you think we're doing the wrong thing paying attention to treatment? We have more stuff because we spend a lot of our time getting down rabbit holes about treatment.
I think it's going to be something to watch. We can't not do treatment. We have to do treatment, but it should really be the government doing it. And then over time, does our portfolio for treatment start as 10% and now is it 95? And then when does it become 100%? It's a very scary, slippery slope. And it's tough to watch how it changes our political prioritization.
thank you very much, Grant.